By the 1820s, America is undergoing a generational shift, moving away from having leaders who were Revolutionary War soldiers and men who wrote the Constitution. Now we have a new generation running the country and running for president. As James Monroe says goodbye after 8 years as president, extremely popular, again, probably could have run for a third term, but the precedent set by George Washington was you stop after 2. So James Monroe of Virginia steps away, and America holds an election of 1824. This election, it's really a strange election because all 4 of these men you see on the screen were from the same party. The Federalist Party had faded away after the War of 1812. So really there was really just one party. And this party, the Democratic Republican Party, will over the next few years kind of morph and shift and separate into new parties. But in the election of 1824, William Crawford, John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and Andrew Jackson are running for president from the same party. William Crawford is from Georgia. John Quincy Adams, of course, is the son of John Adams, our second president. Henry Clay was a leading war hawk during the War of 1812. He was from Kentucky. And Andrew Jackson is a famous general from the War of 1812. And he was famous also for acquiring Florida for the United States and fighting the Seminole Indians in Florida. So he was a war hero and had great name recognition. But all 4 of these men are going to battle it out in this election of 1824, but they're from the same party. So here's the election results from that year. You can see that it would look like on paper that Andrew Jackson, he gets more electoral votes and he gets about 50,000 more votes from the people. The problem is that's not how you win president. To become president, you have to get the majority in the Electoral College. The popular vote doesn't matter. So even though Jackson got more votes than the others in the Electoral College, he did not receive a majority. And so when this happens, it falls to the House of Representatives. And when the House of Representatives gets together, they begin to try to decide who would be president. Well, it gets pretty easy because William Crawford dies of a stroke when all this is going on. And that left Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, and Henry Clay. And of course, Henry Clay is the Speaker of the House of Representatives, so he runs the House. He's in charge of who could be the next president. And he realizes that it's probably not his time, so he organizes the House of Representatives to select John Quincy Adams. The way it works is the House will pick from the top 3. And even though Andrew Jackson got more votes from the people and more electoral votes, the House of Representatives goes with John Quincy Adams. So, Adams will be our 6th president, and it will be one of the most controversial elections. Thanks to Henry Clay, as Speaker of the House, throwing his weight behind John Quincy Adams, Adams becomes president. And of course, soon after, Henry Clay will be made Secretary of State by Adams. Now, Secretary of State back then meant really a great stepping stone to being elected president. And so Jackson reacts, and all of Jackson's supporters react by calling this a corrupt bargain. They point to that this group of power elites, the son of a president, orchestrating a way to get elected when he did not get the most votes. So it really will overshadow John Quincy Adams, his presidency. And in many ways, it will be ineffective thanks to the work of Andrew Jackson just constantly during 4 years, just always kind of bringing this up when he's giving speeches as a private citizen, just saying he should be president, not Adams. So Adams will have 4 years as president, and not a lot will be accomplished in terms of great American first or growth, but probably a decent, honest man, and will later go on to serve in the House of Representatives after leaving the presidency. So really, this is the only time in history where a former president goes back to Congress to serve in the House of Representatives. So statesman, he's a little cold, a little bit of a cold fish, I guess, but just will be president for 4 years. It's also important to talk about Henry Clay. Henry Clay is a big deal in the first half of the 1800s. You know, he'll be the Speaker of the House, as we just mentioned. He'll be a senator from Kentucky, a Secretary of State, and he's going to run for president multiple times, but he'll never win. He ran in 1824, he ran in 32, and he ran in 1844. But he's most known, really, for being a leader in the Congress. He will develop what's known as the American system, which is a system that has basically three parts to it. One, protective tariffs, which begins in 1816, just trying to make sure that the European goods are more expensive and American goods are cheaper. He believes this will spur American industry and growth, and tariffs have been a thing all through American history. It's not just a thing in the 2020s. It was a thing in the 1820s. It was a thing in the 1920s. It's always been a thing. Tariffs are taxes that are brought in, money that's brought in on things coming into the country. And we'll talk a great deal about the tariffs in the 1800s. Secondly, he believed in the national bank. The original national bank was Alexander Hamilton's idea. Henry Clay will push for a second national bank in 1816, and that will be around in the 1820s and will be an issue really in the early 1830s for Andrew Jackson. And Henry Clay was big on improving America's transportation system. He was pushing for the national road and the canal system, like the Erie Canal and the canals through Ohio. And it will greatly improve transportation of people and goods and the spreading of ideas. So Henry Clay, probably the most famous non-president in the 1800s. He is critical, really, in some of the things that are happening, especially in the first half of the 1800s. By the time we get to the mid-1850s or so, he's kind of fading from the scene, but I'll have a few things to say about the Compromise of 1850, which we'll talk about soon. So after 4 years of John Quincy Adams and 4 years of Andrew Jackson railing against how he was robbed from the presidency, the election of 1828 rolls around, and it will be a rematch between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. And by this time, you know, the Democratic, or the national, we should say the Republicans, Democratic Republicans, have kind of started to split into two separate groups. The National Republicans would be what John Quincy Adams is a part of, and Andrew Jackson remains part of what we'd call the Democratic Republicans, kind of the party of James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. And John Quincy Adams will be a National Republican, but eventually that will morph into a political party called the Whigs. So when you look at this rematch in 1828, Andrew Jackson versus John Quincy Adams, the contrast really is very strong, because if you think about John Quincy Adams, former Secretary of State, he'd been president, he Harvard man, his dad was the president, very much an elite in America. Andrew Jackson, born poor, lived a very rough life as a child, and will have been a lot of death in his family. And, you know, his father dies, his mother's trying to raise him, his brother will die in the Revolution, he will be wounded by a British soldier, so he just doesn't like the British at all. Like, his face will be cut with a sword just in an incident to humiliate a young Andrew Jackson as maybe 12 or 13 years old. So he's just got a lot of stuff going on. He's a complicated person who's had a rough life. So he's very much a common person. We've never had anyone like him really become president before. Maybe it's helpful to think of it like this. Which one of these dogs do you think is the best? Right? The one in the upper left is a purebred white lab. Right? It looks good. Its features, people would think this is a really good-looking dog. You would probably pay a lot of money to get this dog. The one on the bottom right is a cute dog, could be a great pet, but not a purebred, not a dog that comes from great lineage. So, which one of these do you think is Andrew Jackson? And which one of these dogs do you think would represent John Quincy Adams? The American people in 1828, do not care so much about the person's lineage or pedigree so much. It's who they are, and they loved Andrew Jackson as a war hero and just like the people's person, and they hoped he would be the people's president. But again, complicated. Batman is complicated. A lot of things going on in Batman's brain. Troubled childhood, a lot of anger, a lot of resentment, a pretty big chip on his shoulder. Same thing can be said about Andrew Jackson. Probably a lot going on in his head. He had a very rough childhood. His time in the military shaped who he was. He was a rough fighter. He was rough around the edges. And some people would say he would need polish, right? He needs a little bit of polish. But when he's elected and he wins by a lot in 1828, it ushers in what historians call the age of Andrew Jackson. The seventh president is not a wealthy Easterner. He's not a Harvard man. Every president we'd had up until this point had been from the East and had some connection really to the Revolution, either fought in it or dad was a president or something. But Andrew Jackson is a common man, kind of born on the frontier. Now he lives in Tennessee, very raw and direct. It might remind you of a president we have in the 2020s. Would just tell you to your face what he thinks, not really that smooth. And he's kind of like a hard man, meaning he's just rough. And so a hard wood that you'd find in nature is the hickory tree. And so his nickname becomes Old Hickory because he's just kind of tough and hard. He will be the first real Democrat. And people start to say, Andrew Jackson, he's such a jackass. And with that, when he hears about this, he will say, yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, I am stubborn and I am sure-footed and I am smart. So yeah, let's take that and run with it. So Andrew Jackson takes the donkey that was meant as an insult for him and turns it around and uses it as his symbol. And even today, the Democrats still use the donkey as a symbol, going back to Old Hickory, Andrew Jackson. And when he's elected, it proves really anybody can be elected president in this country. And it's a huge shift from the elites to the common people. And it's really the first time we're having kind of democratic elections where just anybody can really run the country. And that we're seeing now that most states are allowing anybody to vote as long as you're a white male. You don't have to own property anymore. So more and more common people are voting. Again, nobody of color and no women are voting. But because you're letting the working class men vote, they are really flocking to Andrew Jackson. So this time period where it's really power to the common people is known as Jacksonian Democracy. So when Jackson takes his oath of office and moves into the White House, it is overrun with common people just showing up, coming in, having a party. Like he just lets anybody in. They come in, break dishes, eat the food, have a huge kind of a common person party. This would never have happened under John Quincy Adams or James Madison or John Adams or George Washington. Of course, George Washington lived in the White House, but none of these former presidents would ever just let common folks just hang out in the White House. So it's really a shift in American history. And because Jackson is so complicated, he brings a lot of baggage with him. There are certain things that he stands for, that he loves, and then there are certain things he just cannot handle at all. So over the next few slides, we'll talk about some of the things that Jackson loved and what Jackson could not stand. Okay, so one of the big things that's going to be a part of the 1820s and the 1830s will be these tariffs. Remember, a tariff is a tax on anything. So a little bit of money that a foreign company pays to bring their goods into the United States. Today, of course, it could be anything. Wine from France, syrup from Canada, Altoids from the United Kingdom. But it's also important to remember that in the 1800s, tariffs were the main source of money of our government. We did not have an income tax yet. So any money the government got, it really got through tariffs and fees that from things that were brought in. It wasn't until the 16th Amendment in 1913 that we altered the Constitution to allow our federal government to tax our income. So tariffs were a thing, a powerful tool the government had. But just like today, tariffs can have positive and negative effects. Some of the negative effects can be in the short term that goods from other countries are more expensive, and it can really kind of tap the brakes on the economy a little bit as people try to struggle to get enough money to buy some of the basic goods. And if you're well off, tariffs don't affect you that much. It generally is felt more by people who are working class poor or barely getting by when things go up. Like if you're super rich and a bottle of wine goes from $1 to $2, it doesn't matter to you. But if you're poor and you're barely making ends meet each month, then any raising of prices can have an impact on your family life. This is how it was in the 1800s. The tariffs, many believed, were a good thing, but they did cause certain sections of the country that tended to be a little poorer to struggle. The South then didn't have a lot of factories. It was mostly agricultural, a little bit less money down there than, say, in New England and the middle states like New York and Pennsylvania. So the South sometimes felt tariffs, the sting of tariffs, a little more. And that will happen when Jackson is president. Even though the tariffs have been voted on and have been around for a while, they start to impact greatly the southern states. And so that brings Jackson to one of his big crises, a crisis during his presidency. And it's with his own vice president. John C. Calhoun had been a war hawk during the War of 1812. He had served several presidents. He'd been Secretary of War and now was vice president and would be vice president a couple times. But he is from South Carolina, and in the South, they cannot handle the tariffs. That's hurting the South. So he's working to get the tariffs gone, but the people in Congress aren't really wanting to give up the tariffs because it's a source of income for the United States. So what Calhoun does is he brings back the old idea of nullification. Remember, these ideas that states don't have to follow the rules go way back to 1798 when James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, in protest of the Alien and Sedition Acts, when they went to Virginia and Kentucky. And we have the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions where they would say we're not going to follow the law in these states. Well, that's what Calhoun is doing now as vice president. He's bringing back this idea that if states don't like the law, if the states feel that the laws that are passed are unconstitutional, then they don't have to follow them. In Calhoun's mind, in Vice President Calhoun's mind, the Supreme Court was not the ultimate test of the constitutionality of something. It was the states. The states were sovereign, and they could decide what rules fit with the Constitution or not. Of course, this doesn't fit with what we think of today, but this was the way many people thought back then. And so Calhoun will say that South Carolina doesn't have to follow the rules on the tariff, and they are going to nullify that law. Now, this will turn into a bigger struggle because Congress will pass what's called the Force Bill, which will give Jackson the authority to enforce the tariffs in the South, collect the money that's needed. And so we are heading towards a showdown. This is 30 years after the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. We're still seeing this idea of who's the boss, states or the federal government. Jackson's now been empowered by the Congress to enforce it, but his own vice president is pushing to nullify, and even there's talk that if it doesn't go that way, if for some reason they can't nullify, then South Carolina and other states have the right to secede, to leave the Union. And of course, Jackson, while he might be a common man and he believes in the states, he will work to preserve the Union. In fact, he says he will hang any man who tries to work to end or leave the Union. And so it's really a showdown between the president, who wants to preserve the Union, and it is his own vice president who is pushing for nullification and possibly even secession. And so it doesn't end well for Calhoun in the end. But again, back to the Congress, though, Henry Clay will save Calhoun by helping to come up with some laws that will reduce the tariffs over time. And by the time the Congress gets to 1842, and by the time the country gets to 1842, the tariffs go away. But it's a slowly, gradual disappearance of these tariffs. But it doesn't seem like these southern states, starting with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, and now with this nullification crisis, as the South reacts to the tariffs. They would recall these tariffs the tariffs of abomination. They hate it. They don't want to be anything anyway connected to it. They want to nullify them and maybe even leave. So these men who think this way, they're not going to go away. Right? They're going to continue to push this as things continue to kind of heat up between different sections of the country. And eventually, Calhoun in the 1850s will be really pushing more for South Carolina to just secede and leave the Union. So Jackson loves the Union, and Calhoun, the vice president, willing to leave the Union over tariffs. Another issue that Jackson has is with the bank. Remember, we had the first national bank created by Hamilton, and in the 18 teens, we have a second Bank of the United States that would regulate the currency of the United States, provide, I think the estimates are about $70 million of banking and loans around 1832. They would provide credit, and they would often control the smaller state banks. So this second Bank of the United States, many believe, like Henry Clay, believed that it was absolutely essential. You needed a bank like this where it would kind of control the other banks. 20% of the federal money was put in this bank. So it was an important institution, according to Clay and Daniel Webster. These both men will eventually become Whigs, which is the party that will shape as a result of Andrew Jackson's policies. But let's think about what you know about Andrew Jackson. Do you think he's a favor of the bank? Everything that he's been through, who he is as a person. In his mind, bankers are just rich people who are elite, who think they're better than you, and a national bank is an institution of elite power. And people who run the bank are elitist. And so if you're a banker, you just sit at a desk all day, you count money, you don't even really work, but you control the future of all these hardworking people who have to come to you and beg for money. And if you decide that they're good enough, you'll give them some of the money, but if they can't pay it back, you take everything. So there's a lot of anger on the part of poor and farmers towards bankers. And so Andrew Jackson, being a common man, does not look at bankers favorably. And maybe we'll stick with our animal theme. Which one of these do you think is the banker? And which one of these do you think is Andrew Jackson? Right? Fat cat on the left just lays around getting fatter and fatter every day. Whereas the cat on the right, hardworking, you got to go find your food every day. No one's just going to give it to you. Scrappy little wild cat that has to make ends meet every day, no idea where its food's going to come from, living day to day. So Andrew Jackson relates more to the cat on the right. Hardworking, mean, aggressive cat that's got to fight and claw to survive. The fat cat, banker, just lays around and gets rich off the hard work of other people. So Andrew Jackson hates the National Bank. He hates everything it stands for. He thinks we don't need it. We have smaller banks, that'll be fine. And he thinks really it's unconstitutional. So he will spend a good bit of his presidency trying to bring this bank down. The The bank is up for rechartering. It's actually Henry Clay who pushes for it to be rechartered a little bit early, thinking it would be a great campaign issue in 1832, because Henry Clay is running for president in 1832. As you can see in this political cartoon, Jackson works to just bring down this bank. He thinks it's a terrible idea for America, that just the working class people will be held captive to this big mother bank. So Henry Clay, though, thinks it would be an issue that would help him get elected. But in the end, Clay was wrong. Jackson will veto the bank bill because he thinks it's unconstitutional. Jackson also thought that the president had the right to declare things unconstitutional, which is a bit of a stretch, but he says it's unconstitutional in 1832, and the national bank dies. In fact, Jackson takes a lot of the money out of the national bank, puts it in smaller banks. He just moves the money away. There's a lot of similarities between how Andrew Jackson interacted with people and what he did and what he thought of big institutions. Like President Trump does many of the same things. It really does kind of rock the country in some ways because of what he believes about the bank and what in the 2020s what President Trump and others want to do with the national government. But Jackson is a man on a mission. He does not want the bank. He thinks it hurts America. It's bad for the common people. And in 1832, though, the people agree. They vote for him to be president, and he soundly defeats Henry Clay, as you can see by the numbers here. And Jackson is super popular. The bank might have been popular with Henry Clay and some of the elites, but with the common people, they don't want the bank. Now, they might need the bank, but they don't like bankers. And so it's a weird time, but the bank does go away. Henry Clay, probably the most famous loser in American history. He will lose the presidency many times, but he's super important in Congress, and we're not done talking about him yet. Andrew Jackson continues on for another 4 years of his presidency, and the age of Jackson continues. Now, another thing that Jackson gets a lot of heat for today is a law that was passed at his urging in 1830 by Congress called the Indian Removal Act. And Jackson and many states wanted the natives off the land, living there in the land, just kind of taking up good land that might have gold or resources on it or that people might want to live on. So Congress passes the law, and Jackson begins the order of forcibly relocating Native Americans. And this will take many years. It's not going to be a single event in the 1830s, and it'll continue on after Jackson is president. And mostly the most famous part of it, the Trail of Tears, will happen after Jackson is no longer president. But in this whole struggle to get the Native Americans moved off, and then of course their struggle to stay, the United States Supreme Court will say that the natives can stay. Jackson says they got to go. And famously, Jackson says, the Supreme Court has made their decision, now let them enforce it, meaning they have no one to enforce it. The president has the army and the federal muscle to make things happen. The courts have nothing. So Jackson here, is really maybe abusing his power by not listening to what the Supreme Court says and just does what he wants to do. So from time to time, presidents will do this. Maybe we're living in a time now where presidents just do what they want to do and they don't always listen to the Supreme Court. So the Indians have to go. It's going to be a process. But the most famous part of this is the Trail of Tears in 1838 and 1839, where the Cherokee, in particular, are marched from their home in, say, North Carolina and Georgia to out to the Indian Territory, which would be Oklahoma. But it's not just the Cherokee, as you can see from this chart. Seminoles in Florida, the Miami, the Ottawa, the Chickasaw, Choctaw, they're all forced off of land that the American government wants for private use, for people to live on, or that had minerals or gold or something. And they're forced to an area that nobody really wanted. and would later become Oklahoma. So when you look at the Oklahoma flag today, as you can see on the screen, it represents all of those native tribes that were forced to be there. And today there's a high concentration of Indian reservations on Oklahoma. There are still some reservations in the east. Some natives did not leave. A lot of the Cherokee hid in the mountains and are still part of North Carolina today. They have a reservation in North Carolina. But this Trail of Tears is the Jackson and Congress relocating the natives. And so some people today are not fans of Andrew Jackson because of how he treated Native Americans in particular, but also how he treated African Americans. So there was a big move to get Andrew Jackson's face off the $20 bill, replace it with Harriet Tubman. And that was kind of getting some traction for a while. And then Donald Trump came back. And since Trump is a fan of Andrew Jackson and the Republicans are controlling Congress, it won't happen anytime soon. But we'll see what happens in the future with Andrew Jackson. And will he stay on our currency, or is he going to get the boot? As a result of Andrew Jackson's ways, he's stubborn like a donkey. He does what he wants. He doesn't really care. Many people refer to him as King Andrew I, meaning he seems to act like a king. And so those people, even in his own party, remember there's only one party at that point, those who kind of don't agree with him start to kind of form this kind of weird potpourri of people who would form what would be called the Whig Party. All right, it's an odd mix. People who were evangelical Protestants who were, you might say, really into going to church and really into the Bible, didn't really like some of the things that Jackson was doing. Some people who didn't like what they called executive usurpation, which is when the president is usurping the power of the people and the Congress and just acting like a king. There were people who were basically starting to be more middle class and moving up the ladder, and they didn't feel like Jackson was their man. They wanted someone that could understand. I mean, Jackson was fighting for the working poor maybe, but what about that new kind of middle class that was starting to appear in America? The people who would want an open market with not a lot of government interference flocked to Jackson. And states' rights, a lot of people who were in the South who didn't really like Jackson for his telling the South, like South Carolina, that you can't leave, you can't nullify you, and you can't secede from the Union. These people will all come together to form this party called the Whigs, which in the United Kingdom, the Whigs were the party that were a little more conservative, that would be a political party in Parliament. So they just took that and made it the name of their party. It's not going to be around very long, but we're going to get about 4 presidents that would say they are Whigs. But Jackson can't be president forever. He too follows George Washington's example, stopping after 2 terms. And when he leaves, it falls to his vice president, Martin Van Buren. Now, Martin Van Buren had been around a long time. We would probably credit Martin Van Buren for creating the modern political system that we have today. Like, he believed in 2 parties. He believed it was a necessity. He would disagree with the founding fathers who didn't want the Constitution to talk about parties at all. They thought parties were bad. Martin Van Buren thought, before he was president and spent his whole career working to build political parties and say they are extremely important. And political parties will be a way to hold the government accountable. So you have a kind of a loyal opposition, if you will, to the president and to Congress, so that if something goes wrong, the new group could come in, they hold the president accountable. And this kind of political operatives, people who believed in politics and political parties, were new. And Martin Van Buren was really the father of that. And most Americans don't know much about him. But if you look at his resume, his experience, he was a U.S. Senator, Governor of New York, Secretary of State, Ambassador to the United Kingdom, and Vice President. So probably nobody ever had a better resume to be president than Martin Van Buren. He knew so much about politics. If Andrew Jackson was Old Hickory, Martin Van Buren was the sly fox. Just knew a lot about politics and was very, very polished compared to Andrew Jackson, who was really rough. Right? They're very much opposites, but they made a good team when Jackson was president and Van Buren was vice president. But now Jackson's retiring, going back to Tennessee, and Martin Van Buren is the president. Elected in 1836, becomes president in 1837. You can see there on the map, the election map, it's really kind of weird because the Whigs, they are a new party and they don't really know what they're doing. And their strategy was to run for Whigs, hoping that they would take away enough votes that it might fall to the House of Representatives again to pick the president. But it doesn't work out that way. Van Buren is elected and becomes the president. And his presidency is going to be really marred by an economic depression, really. It's referred to as the Panic of 1837, as the banks are trying to figure out their role now that the national bank is defeated. Like the smaller banks really don't know what to do. They're really leaning towards following the guidelines of some British banks, and the British are, it's just a very complicated financial situation. But in the end, it causes a lot of bank issues in America, and the common people will be hurt. Remember, back in the day, if banks went out of business, you lost your money. Today, we live in a world where the federal government insures your money in the bank. So if your bank that you have your money in right now, if it were to go out of business, the federal government would insure your money, and you would get up to $250,000 back of that money through the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which was created during the Depression in the 1900s. But in the 1800s, there is no such a thing. So the banks are struggling, people are struggling, and this depression really was the first real depression in American history, and it will be the main focus of Martin Van Buren's presidency. He'll try to do what he can do, but in the end, he just doesn't have the tools to control it. And oftentimes, presidents can only do so much when it comes to the economy. And for 4 years, he'll struggle with this, and this is a chance now for the Whigs to win. So in 1840, the Whigs get together and probably run a little better campaign, deciding not to run for people. They pick one guy to run as president, William Henry Harrison, who'd been a war hero from the War of 1812. Of course, he's really old now, but they're trying to find someone who can kind of be like their version of Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was a war hero from War of 1812, the Battle of New Orleans. And so their version of Andrew Jackson is William Henry Harrison. Seems like a common man, born on, they want people to think he was born on the frontier and a fighter. In reality, he was born in an elite family, but most people didn't know that. They start to see him as this old frontier guy who was just a common guy, even though he wasn't. And he gets elected as president using a slogan called Tippecanoe and Tyler too. So Tippecanoe was referring to his battle that he'd won in 1811, the Battle of Tippecanoe Creek in Indiana, right at the beginning of the War of 1812. And then he'll again be a hero at the Battle of the Thames, where Tecumseh is killed in 1813. So this idea of Tippecanoe and Tyler too, it's the first real political campaign where we're seeing little slogans like this and little flyers and campaign music. It's really the first modern campaign, if you will, where the parties are really campaigning, and it's kind of a fun little thing to do some research on. You can find campaign songs, they're not recorded, but people sing them now off the sheet music, which is really fun to listen to, and you would think probably super, super basic, but it was the first. And Tyler is a Whig from Virginia. And why does we care about Tyler? Well, because William Henry Harrison, he might be an old war hero, but he is old and maybe not the brightest, because he gives a really long inauguration address, a couple hours long in the freezing rain cold, and gets pneumonia and dies just 30 days later. He'll die 1 month into his term, which is the shortest that anyone's ever been a president. So only after a month, William Henry Harrison will die as a result of pneumonia. And John Tyler would become president, and that will change everything. Though here's a quick look at maybe some of the imagery of the election of 1840 with Tippecanoe and Tyler too, William Henry Harrison. The idea that he was born in a log cabin, He really wasn't. He was born in wealth and nice things, but it worked on the campaign. They made him seem like a common guy out on the frontier, a brave, common man who could be a great president. In reality, probably should have worn a coat when he gave a speech and too old, because he was 68 years old back then when he gets elected president. So it falls to John Tyler. And John Tyler now is a Whig, but not really. When he becomes president, well, first of all, we have to, is he actually president? Because we've never had a president die and the vice president become president. Many people thought that John Tyler would be acting president until we could have a special election to pick the new president. But that's not how John Tyler saw it. He had everyone refer to him as the president. There would be no special election. He saw the Constitution as saying now that the president is gone. He is the new president for the remainder of the term. And so he basically sets that tone and nobody really questions it. And that's how it's been. And that's probably what was the intent of the founders. So John Tyler just says, I'm president. We're no special election. I'm going to be the president for most of those 4 years because Harrison died so quickly. But he is not much of a Whig. He's more of this states' rights Democrat. And in fact, the Whigs literally will march from Congress to the White House and kick him out of their party. And so he might have the word Whig next to him as a political party, but he really was a Democrat for most of his presidency. He'll just do that one term, and then he is out. He will not be president be elected president in 1844. So we're heading into these years, which will be important, the 1840s and 50s, as America grows and spreads out west, and as America struggles with slavery, and as America acquires new land, and trying to compromise on all of this will really begin to tear the country apart.